Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here once again with an Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. This time we will be going over the two-handed weapon skill line in all of its glory for PvP and PvE in meta performance for the Elder Scrolls Online. We'll delve right in with our active abilities, the first being the main spammable of the two-handed skill line, which is Uppercut. As all skills and damage in the stamina-based weapon skill line, such as two-handed bow, sword and shield, and dual wield, these skills will scale off of max stamina, weapon damage, weapon critical, and armor penetration, as well as using mighty, piercing, and precise strikes in the champion point system. Now, it should be noted that Uppercut has a cast time. Most skills that have a cast time are considered dots. However, Uppercut only deals damage in a one-hit interval. So even though it has a cast time to it, it is not considered a damage over time component because it only deals one source of damage over time. Now, if Uppercut were broken into two hits, then it would be considered a dot, such as Biting Jabs, Rapid Strikes, Soul Assault. Those skills hit multiple times over time, thus dots. Skills like Uppercut or Crystal Frags will not because they deal damage immediately in a single application. So just because it's a cast time doesn't mean it will necessarily scale with Thaumaturge. You have to look at the damage source and how it will go about dealing those damage. Still, very nice ability. It has a 7 meters range, so remember if we're a melee build, that gives us some breathing room because 5 meters is going to be right in the face of an enemy, and we're going to be really susceptible to those nasty red circles like Whirlwind and stuff that bosses do sometimes that can one-shot us. So being able to back up a little bit to 7 meters gives us some breathing room in terms of reaction. It doesn't cost too much, and the nice thing about this is since it's every 1 second, this means every 2 casts you'll be getting 1 tick of regen, because stamina regen, just as magicka or health regen, comes in 2-second intervals. So cast times do have that added benefit of being able to get their stamina or maximum resource back because their damage is spread out. Now, at the same time, this also means that their damage is going to be staggered in PvE, which is going to overall lessen their total DPS because a lot of their damage has to wait instead of immediately granting it. Uppercut, as we see here, doesn't do anything fancy anymore. The base morph just deals some big hit damage when it lands after the 1 second, and that's it. So really nice for burst damage, but that cast time is ultimately going to lessen its efficiency in terms of meta play for PvE. Now in PvP, burst is king, so being able to wait that 1 second isn't going to be as punishing in PvP because you're going to be rewarded with this massive hit, and the enemy has to heal it immediately, otherwise they're going to be more susceptible to being killed because they're going to be at lower health. So that kind of helps Uppercut perform better in PvP, but in PvE, that cast time going to make it kind of meh in terms of what we need to do, because if we have to block, then that's an issue. If we have to dodge roll, we're losing more DPS than we normally would. And it should be noted that in PvP, it cannot be bashed. Stamina skills with a cast time cannot be bashed. If they were able to be, that would totally decimate them. Stamina skills like Snipe and Uppercut used to be bashable way back when this game first came out, and they were really, really punishing on top of already being kind of meh skills. So can't bash them anymore. Now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Dizzying Swing. And all it does is whenever you hit an enemy with this, you will stun them and knock them back. So you knock them back 4 meters, and the second they're hit with it, the stun duration of 3.5 seconds will begin. So even while they're knocked back, it's not after the knockback. So you do the 1 second cast, hit them like a golf ball, then they fly back 4 meters, and while they're flying, they are stunned. So you can CC break it mid-air, and it will plant you back down on the ground. This is usually the morph we take for PvP because stun and crowd control is going to be more advantageous to us, because locking an enemy out of reaction time and making them spend resources or to just sit there and get wailed on is going to be more beneficial for us because it's going to increase our chance of killing them. While in PvE, We don't really need to do that because our damage is going to be about sustained DPS, not bursting, not crowd control in those regards. And on top of that, it's going to knock them away from us, meaning we have to move and follow them, and it's going to knock them out of like ground AoEs like Arrow Barrage and other stuff. So Dizzying Swing, not good in PvE at all. In PvP, very, very nice. Our other morph is called Wrecking Blow, and all it does is every time you deal damage with the ability, you grant yourself Empower, which lasts 5 seconds, and it increases the damage of your next attack by 20%. Now, it should be noted that Empower cannot be consumed on damage over time abilities. So, things like channeled abilities, like jabs, dots like bleeds and stuff, cannot consume Empower. But the really nice thing is that it can be consumed by another really big hit, so another Wrecking Blow, or a lighter heavy attack, or an ultimate that deals initial damage like Meteor or Flawless Dawnbreaker. Those will be able to be empowered, offering some crazy high burst damage. So if you like two-hander and you go into PvE, Wrecking Blow is going to be the morph for you. Now, I'm going to show something really, really awesome with this skill, and it's going to work by using one of our passives, which I'll explain more in detail later, which is called Follow Up, which just gives you some damage after a heavy attack. So the really nice thing about Wrecking Blow for PvE is that you can heavy attack and Wrecking Blow and have that be pretty much your rotation. Now, obviously, in meta performance, you're going to want to run dots, like if you're a Dragon Knight, Venomous Claw, or if you're using a bow on your back, or Poison Injection, stuff like that. So this isn't going to be all that you do, but it's going to be really nice because we're going to have Empower going to a heavy attack, and then the heavy attack is going to give us half of an Empower to Wrecking Blow. And it just works like this. So first we're going to charge up a heavy attack, and then we're going to Wrecking Blow, and then we're just going to alternate between them, and then one will consume the other. So heavy attack, Wrecking Blow, heavy attack, Wrecking Blow, heavy attack, Wrecking Blow. And this is all you do. Really simple. It should be noted that you can double cast Wrecking Blow in a row if you press it too soon, so you have to be familiar with what your animations look like. So Wrecking Blow is when I lift my arm all the way back and my sword comes to my back, like by my leg, but the heavy attack goes up in the air instead. So all we do is, again, we charge up the heavy attack, and as soon as we've brought the sword to our back with the heavy attack, we press Wrecking Blow, and that will force our heavy attack to land as soon as it is calculated as a fully charged heavy attack, and then we'll do our Wrecking Blow. And as soon as we're done with our Wrecking Blow, we'll do another heavy attack. And the nice thing is you can just literally hold down your left key. So I'll do it again here. Heavy attack, Wrecking Blow. Heavy attack, Wrecking Blow. Really, really simple, and it's doing a lot of damage because my heavy attack gives a 10% damage bonus to my next cast, and then my Wrecking Blow gives me a 20% damage to my next cast. So it's 20, 10, 20, 10. You're getting a lot of free damage. So if you like two-hander a lot, then Wrecking Blow is going to be really nice if you can make use of that follow-up passive, and I'll explain that more in detail later. But in terms of meta performance, usually two-hander is not considered meta for PvE DPS. It doesn't mean it's not viable. You can DPS with one, but compared to dual wield or bow, it's going to be a little lackluster just because we don't have as many other damage-focused skills in our skill line, which I'll explain more so later. But still, Wrecking Blow, really nice more for PvE, Dizzying Swing for PvP. Now we'll have our next ability, and that's Crit Charge, and Crit Rush is a gap closer. And it has a minimum range of 3.5 meters, meaning you have to be at least 3.5 meters away from the enemy to cast it, up to 22 meters. Very straightforward. You just launch yourself in a straight line to the enemy, dealing moderate damage when you get there. And the nice thing is it is always a critical strike, no matter what. So the only time this ability will not crit is if you are hitting an enemy with a damage shield, because damage shields cannot be crit. So this is kind of nice if you like running high critical hit modifiers. So if you're in a group that's running Warhorns in PvP, or you're utilizing Trap Beast in PvP, or you're using the Shadow Mundus, you're going to get a little bit of extra efficiency because your crit hit damage is going to be amped and you're always going to crit. Now in terms of a spammable, Crit Rush is by no means meant to be spammed. It's meant for you to get as close to your enemy very quickly without having to like walk over there or sprint or anything like that. So not meant to be spammed. Still very nice in PvP, helps close the gap, especially when enemies are trying to run away. And then all gap closers have a snare on them, so that also helps keep enemies in place. Now, I would really like if the snares would go away. I think they're very brutal and frustrating to deal with because multiple people can just spam stuff like Crit Rush or Ambush or other gap closers on you and just lock you in place with not much you can do. But still, Crit Rush, really nice ability, closes the gap in PvP, and in PvE, it is really, really useless. I see people use it a lot. It's mainly people who like aren't doing the meta stuff, aren't doing the efficient builds. They're just doing stuff because it's fun. The skill really does not fit well into PvE because the tank's job is to pull everything to the same area, and then you go there and you sit still. You're not necessarily supposed to be running around like a monkey, crit rushing to multiple enemies. They should be clumped up. They should be getting cleaved down, etc. And if you do need to walk away, you just sprint or dodge roll. You don't want to have an entire bar spot dedicated to this like semi-usable skill, because it's not going to be able to be used in a rotation normally, so it's not going to be justified in PvE. Now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Stampede, and all Stampede does is when you deal damage with the ability, reduce the movement speed of the target you hit by 60% for 8 seconds. So really straightforward, a snare on top of a snare, because remember the base skill, any gap closer will snare an enemy while you are closing the distance. So after you hit them, the snare will disappear. So with Stampede, it helps keep them locked in place even more, making them have to use shuffle or retreating maneuvers or dodge roll or whatever it is. So it helps keep them in place a little bit easier. Our next morph is called Critical Rush, and all it does is it increases the damage that you deal with this skill based on how far you traveled. So the farther away you went, the more damage it does. So at 3.5 meters range, this will not get any damage bonus, and then at the 22 meters range, it will get the 68% more damage. So the 68, the full efficiency we get at rank 4, will only be granted if we cast it at max range, which is 22 meters, which is pretty far away. And then we get that big hit in there. But yeah, usually Crit Rush is the morph that we're going to take just because it offers some more burst damage, especially against classes like the Sork who are using Streak. That distance is going to be quite large, so we're just going to get a lot of free damage. However, Stampede's still really nice, the snare, so if you don't have snares built into your kit already, you can kind of choose what you want. Our next skill is the Two-Handed's AoE ability, and that is Cleave. And Cleave is a pretty mediocre ability. It doesn't operate as a radius, although the tooltip mentions it, and a radius means it would be a circle, and it doesn't actually do that because Cleave is, as it mentions, or as the name would imply, a cleave. So instead of a circle around us, it just hits 7 meters out in front of us. It's roughly the same size as the Nightblade's Twisting Path. So if I put down Twisting Path, you can see it literally lines up almost perfectly with Twisting Path's hit. So it's probably about 1 meters higher. So Cleave is pretty straightforward. It operates by hitting in a big area in front of us. It says 7 meters radius, so it's going to be similar to Ren's size in terms of hit detection. If you remember in the dual wield skill, the Ren attack was a 7 by 8 meters radius, and Cleave is almost identical. It doesn't specify that. I really wish it would, but it's almost the same size. So if we look here, I'm easily able to hit all 4 because they're nice and grouped up. But the issue is if I like look over here, I'm only hitting 2 of them, even though it looks like I should be able to hit all 4. So this is kind of why Cleave isn't very meta in terms of performance, because remember Steel Tornado from Dual Wield is going to hit that big circle around us, so I'm just easily able to hit all 4 without even having to look at them. So that's really advantageous, because a lot of times we're not going to be able to position ourselves and enemies aren't going to clump up like this nice group that we have here. So like if I'm looking here, I'm missing completely, and only until I start backing up I hit 3 of them, but not all 4. I have to position myself, so that's going to really lower the efficiency of Cleave in meta performance. The nice thing about Cleave is that it deals initial damage and then it applies a dot, and the dot will scale with Thaumaturge because it is a damage over time function, and it's also a bleed, meaning it will not need armor penetration to deal its maximum damage, so it'll always do true damage, which is really helpful, but ultimately it's still not going to bring it in line with other things. The only real advantage of Cleave is that it can apply its debuff to multiple targets, but if we look here, if I just keep casting it over and over again, the bleed isn't taking into effect. So we have to let the Cleave go out. If I wait 1 second, then we see Cleave bleed. So we have to wait a whole second before it starts dealing damage. But in AoE DPS, we want to just be spamming it and hitting as many targets as possible. So we're not going to get that bleed portion of it, ultimately killing the skill. On top of the fact that it's already hitting less enemies than Steel Tornado, dealing less damage than Steel Tornado. If we look at the tooltip, Cleave is actually it's close, but it's still less than Steel Tornado, hitting less enemies, but costs roughly the same when we have our dual wield bar on. So yeah, Cleave not really in a good spot. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Carve, and all that does is whenever we deal damage with Carve, we grant ourselves minor heroism, which increases our ultimate generation. All it does is we get 1 ultimate every 1.5 second for 9 seconds. So really straightforward, helps get some ulti gen. This is not the only source of minor heroism in the game, and like the tanks are going to have access to it, so we don't need to run a 2-hander, thankfully, and we can get it on a few other skills as well, but ultimately not going to do too much for us, because it's 1 ultimate every 1.5 seconds. That's not going to really change the tide of battle. We're already operating at that deficit compared to Steel Tornado or even the bow's acid spray or arrow spray ability. So yeah, really lackluster. But the other morph is called Brawler, and all Brawler does is every time you use the skills, you don't even have to hit an enemy, you gain a damage shield that it is moderate in size, and the strength of the shield will increase for each enemy hit by 100% for each enemy hit. So remember, all AoE abilities, if they have secondary functions, the maximum target cap will be 6. So the maximum shield bonus we'll get is 600% if we hit all 6 targets. So if we look here, I cast Brawler, I get a damage shield even though I'm not hitting anything. So that's kind of nice. Allows us to load off some of the damage when we go into a fight. But still, it's going to be really small because it's going to scale with weapon damage. So like if I apply Rally, that will go up. So it will use weapon damage, will use stamina, all that good stuff. But still, it's a really small shield, and in Cyrodiil it's going to be hit by Battle Spirit. But in terms of like hitting big groups, like when I hit this big group, we see a much bigger shield. And the nice thing is if we spam cast, it instantly refreshes. So it helps take off some punishment in PvE and PvP, especially if you're leveling in PvE and you're pulling like massive groups of enemies and you want to use a 2-hander for PvP, then Brawler is going to be a nice option because it's going to help you take more punishment, and since we don't have access to healing easily as stamina builds at low level, that's going to really help us. But in terms of meta performance, like when we hit endgame level cap, go into PvE or in PvP, Brawler and even the other morph and the base skill are just really in a bad spot right now. Outclassed by class AoEs and beaten by both bows and dual wields AoE abilities. So really lackluster. Very unfortunate, and it's kind of another reason why it's not performing well in PvE. Remember, the same issue happened with Wrecking Blow and its other morphs, was that it's not performing well in PvE. So we're seeing a sort of theme here between these skills, as none of these skills right now are operating efficiently in terms of meta performance for PvE. But now we'll go on to our next skill, and that is called Reverse Slash. And Reverse Slash is the execute of the two-handed skill line. All we do is we deal damage, and it deals up to 300% more damage to enemies with less than 50% health. So this is a scaling execute similar to Radiant Destruction, if you remember from the Templar class. So when it deals 300% bonus damage, the enemy will be at 0.1% health. So you only get that full 300% when an enemy is literally almost dead. It starts scaling at 50%. So at 50%, it gets 1% more damage, and then it keeps scaling upwards to 300%. So it's not as strong as the tooltip would imply, and it's ultimately going to be why it's not that good in PvE. Now, in PvP, things are different. Not every class has access to an immediate execute, like the Stamina Dragonite or the Stamina Sork. The Stamina Sork has a pseudo-execute in form of Implosion, but Reverse Slash is going to bring some immediate damage, which makes them all the more terrifying in PvP, because remember, PvP is all about burst, killing an enemy as quickly as possible, and having an execute that starts scaling at 50% really soon into the battle allows us to just really cut through some of our enemies' HP pools, really just decimating them and killing them, moving on to the next target and doing the same thing. So Reverse Slash is really helpful in PvP. Now in PvE, remember that the damage just isn't really going to be there right away. It's optimal to start casting in PvE at around 32%-ish, similar to the Templar with Radiant Destruction. So you can use it in PvE. It will be nice if your class doesn't have an execute. However, it should be noted that if you're like a Nightblade, then Killer's Blade is going to be better, and we're not going to really want to use this. On top of the fact that in PvE, two-hander just isn't bringing in the DPS at the moment. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Reverse Slice, and Reverse Slice converts the skill into an AoE, so it's going to add some splash damage, and what happens is when you hit an enemy, other nearby enemies within a 5 meters radius of the target you hit will take 61% of the damage that target took. So the really nice thing about this is that if you're hitting an enemy who's at low health, they're going to be taking that extra execute damage, and then Reverse Slice's splash damage is going to split 61% of that damage. So it's not 61% of the tooltip, it's 61% of the damage you did to that target. So this means if you crit that target and you're doing a lot of execute damage, then that 61% is going to go to the other enemies, and on top of that, that damage can crit on top of itself. So sometimes in very few applications, we can see Reverse Slice's splash damage actually doing more damage than the initial hit, because it can crit twice in effect. It's gating things like percent health applications in terms of if they're missing health, they're going to take more, and so on. So Reverse Slice is really nice when we're fighting people nice and grouped up together. So it's not really an AoE Zerg buster like ZeniMax wanted it to be, but it does provide a lot of burst damage and a lot of deceptive damage when using it against proper targets. So look out for that in terms of when you're using it. Very nice. The other morph is called Executioner, and all that does is it increases the execute scaling from up to 300% to up to 335%. So at that 0.1% health, they're getting another 35% more damage taken, and it also means that it'll start scaling up faster as they're getting lower health. So Executioner is going to be beneficial to cast at 35% instead of 32%. In terms of when you can start executing and when it's going to beat out spammable abilities like Wrecking Blow and whatnot. Very, very nice. If you're taking the PvE role, just remember that two-handed PvE DPS is not very good at the moment. Still, if you're set in your ways and you want a DPS with it, then Executioner is going to be usually the morph we'll take. Now, in terms of like if you're going to go into trials and stuff, although I'm not sure how you're going to be able to do that with a two-hander DPS, but if your group is more acceptable to that stuff and they don't mind it, or you're able to use like a really cool build like the Dragon Knight class can make use of the two-hander in PvE, then you're probably going to take Executioner for single target. But if you're doing stuff like Rakat or a lot of cleave damage in terms of boss fights where there's adds, then Reverse Slice is actually going to be better for you because you're going to get a lot more DPS out of it. So pretty straightforward skills, very, very nice in terms of the rest of the skills, probably one of the best skills out of this weapon line. Now, there's also a thing called Macro Slice with it. It's actually looks like it's fixed on the PTS, which which is the server that I'm doing all this testing on. I haven't noticed it get like caught up like it does on live, so that's really, really nice. Now we'll look at our last ability, and that is Momentum. And Momentum is a utility ability. Pretty straightforward. All it does is it grants us Major Brutality for 33 seconds, which increases our weapon damage by 20%. Really straightforward. Costs a moderate amount of stamina to cast, but that's also because it lasts so long. The other thing that it does is it adds a heal over time on us whenever we use it. So if we look here, I activate it and I get a heal, and then it just heals every 2 seconds. So 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. So every 2 seconds we get that heal. Or no. So all you do is you cast it, and then you get a heal every 2 seconds. And the nice thing is that this will scale up based on your stats actively. So this will constantly be going up and down. So if you drink a potion or you get like Warhorn on you or something, these numbers will fluctuate as we go. You don't have to recast it to gain benefit. In terms of like PvP and PvE, like when we're wanting to have this skill be at its maximum efficiency, we don't have to wait until everything's lined up and then cast it. We can just let it roll and then apply our buffs. So really helpful in that regard. Now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Forward Momentum. And Forward Momentum simply reduces the cost of the skill by quite a noticeable amount, about 800 stamina when we look at it. So very, very big cost reduction. And then it grants immunity to all snare and immobilizations. So it removes them if you have them on you and grants you immunity for 5 seconds. So that's really, really helpful. It's like a shuffle, but instead of getting evasion, we're getting a heal. Now the issue with this is that this does not grant you immunity to gap closer snares. That really brutal, frustrating snare I was talking about. If an enemy uses a gap closer on you and you use Forward Momentum, that snare will not go away. And this is ultimately the nail in the coffin for this skill, because the biggest issue in PvP right now in terms of like snare stacking and all of like being just slowed down to the pace of a snail is because people are just constantly using gap closers on you. And since Forward Momentum doesn't make us immune to that, it's redundant. It's not going to be able to do anything. Like, we're better off running Shuffle because we're going to gain some defenses from it too. But Shuffle does the same thing, which is really unfortunate. So I would really like Forward Momentum and Shuffle to start removing and making us immune to those gap closer snares, or just to have the gap closer snares go away, because they're really, really frustrating. But outside of that, pretty nice, although if you are running Shuffle, there isn't much reason to use Forward Momentum. Our other morph is by far the better morph in terms of what we're trying to do with this skill, like healing and whatnot, and that is Rally. And what Rally does is doesn't increase the base heal, so it still ticks the same as Forward Momentum or just base momentum, But when the heal expires, we also get a slightly larger burst heal. And the really nice thing about this is that the final heal that we get out of it will scale up based on how long we let it sit there. So if we let Rally tick the full 33 seconds, we're going to get a 564% bonus to that final heal tick, which is already larger. So it's going to be this big, massive burst. The other really nice thing about Rally is that you can decide when this skill technically ends. So if you let it roll on you, like here, I'll take it, and I'll let it roll on me for a few seconds. But if we recast it, that will consider the skill to be ended. And then it'll give us a burst heal. So see here, I got that 2.8k crit and the lesser one. The lesser one was the new cast that I did, and then that 2.8k that we saw was because the old one had ended, so I was granted that burst. So that's really, really helpful for stamina builds because it's going to give us that burst heal on demand when we need it in PvP. So in terms of healing, this is like one of the very few options that stamina builds have, but at the same time, Rally and Vigor, when paired together, like the two only universal stam heals in the game, they're going to be really, really strong in PvP. But in PvE, these aren't going to really do much to us in terms of like keeping us alive in fights, because most of the fights in PvE deal with big high burst damage, because it's about, oh hey, you stood in red, or the boss looked at you and hit you. So those are going to be way more punishing, and Rally and Vigor aren't going to be as strong as they are versus in PvP, where we're just constantly healing off. So this is why two-hander is really nice in PvP. A lot of these skills in here deal with parameters that focus more on player versus player combat, burst damage, CC, utility of mobility, etc. So this is why two-handed is so strong in PvP, but at the same time, since it focuses so heavily on those, it's going to be really weak for PvE. So unfortunate, but it's still a very strong weapon skill line, but it's still focused more on PvP, especially when we have utility ability not used in PvE, a self-heal that's rather moderate isn't going to really change anything in terms of survivability in PvE. An execute that's kind of I mean, especially compared to other class executes, arguably one of the worst AoEs in the game, and then a cast time spammable. So really, really meh in PvE, but in PvP, these are way seen as way stronger because they do things differently, and PvP calls for different actions. But now we'll move on to our ultimate, and that is Berserker Strike. Berserker Strike costs 150 ultimate, which is pretty moderate. I mean, most ultimates cost in between 100 to 200 ultimate, so right in the middle. It's instant cast, it has a 5 meters range, and it deals more damage than a spammable. So when you deal damage with this skill, whatever target you hit, you're going to also ignore their resistances. So their physical and spell resistance. These numbers here that you see, spell resistance and physical resistance. If someone were to hit me with Berserker Strike, they would gain, or they would mitigate these. They would hit me as if I'm at 0, and on top of that, they would also gain those. So however much resistances you mitigate or ignore, you also gain for 8 seconds, making us tankier. So we're going to do more damage to them, and then we're going to be tankier for everyone hitting us. So very, very nice. Plays into that like Berserker role, going right in, emphasizing the risk-reward mechanic of put this on like a tank or something, so you gain a bunch of mitigation, easily hitting mitigation cap in PvP. And then 8 seconds is a decent amount of time to make some changes in combat. So like going into a group, killing some of their people, and then pulling off. And the other really nice thing about this skill is that in PvP, we have access to Combat Frenzy, which gives us ultimate when we kill a player. So that's going to really help increase the uptime on that secondary effect of being tankier and then dealing more damage to whoever we use it on. But in PvE, the importance of penetration will ultimately outweigh this ultimate. So this ultimate is going to make a target's resistance and physical resistance be taken to 0, but the object of PvE in the current meta is to already have an enemy's mitigation next or as close to 0 as possible. So in PvE, once again, we have an ability that isn't really getting its full efficiency and ultimately going to be really lackluster. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Onslaught. And what Onslaught does is anytime you kill an enemy with this cast, so if you cast this and you kill the enemy with it, you immediately refund the 150 ultimate cost. So it's a free cast. So if you dunk on someone, you kill them with it, we get a free cast. Really straightforward, and it emphasizes that like domino effect, the risk reward. Go in and bop that healer right on the head when they're low health, kill them with it, and then you're able to turn around and do it again to the next guy. So you can chain this theoretically infinitely as long as you're killing people with it. Now, in terms of how often that's going to happen, not really. But the other nice thing about this skill is that we're going to be able to use this and then spend that 150 ultimate on other ultimates. So like we can swap to Dawnbreaker and then use that if we see a nice group come in after we kill the target we killed the first person with Onslaught. So that's going to be really advantageous. Now, the issue with this is that if we cast Onslaught, that when we have over 150 ultimate, we're not going to get all of the ultimate we consumed back. We're just going to get the 150 base back. So keep that in mind. The other morph is called Berserker's Rage, and all it does is it makes you immune to all disabling, snare, and immobilization effects for the 8-second duration that we get. So like the same duration that we steal the resistances and ignore the resistances of the enemy, we're also going to be immune to all disabling and crowd control effects. So this is really, really strong because immovability is only accessible through CC Break, which does not make us immune to snares, can only be done while we're CC'd and lasts 7 seconds on the PTS, it's 5 seconds on live, or from immovability potions, which just makes us immune to stuns or knockbacks, not snares, not immobilizes. So Berserker's Rage is really going to help us be immune to all forms of crowd control. I'm not 100% sure if this makes us immune to snares, though. So, like, remember the gap closer snare? If that still affects Berserker's Rage, then this is ultimately useless once again, because the purpose of this is meant to be like shrugging off all slows, all snares. So if it doesn't work against that really, really sucks. So if this makes you immune to the gap closer snare, drop a comment. If it does, then awesome. If it doesn't, then rip. But now we'll move on to our passive abilities, and our first passive is called Forceful. And anytime we deal light or heavy attack damage with a two-handed weapon, we hit up to 2 nearby enemies. I believe the radius is 5 meters, so if they're 5 meters or less away from the initial enemy you're hitting, they'll take 26% of the damage you dealt to the primary target. So it's similar to the reverse slice, where it deals damage based on damage. So if you hit for 1,000 damage on the main guy, then the guy on his left and his right within 5 meters are going to take 260 damage. Now the nice thing is that the secondary damage can crit. So if you crit with the first one, the second one can crit again, allowing it to be very, very damaging in terms of cleave situation. So this brings in some cleave damage for the two-handed weapons in terms of PvE and in PvP. But still, it's not going to do anything fantastic. It's kind of fluff damage, but it's there. I think it would be really interesting if they made it where all of your damage mirrored up to 2 targets nearby them for the two-handed. That would really incentivize cleave damage for the two-hander and really bring them kind of in line with the dual-wield skill, where any damage you deal, as long as it's from like a weapon, so not like arrow barrage or some ground AoE, any initial hit damage would also split. That would be really, really cool. I'd love to see that. Our next passive is called Heavy Weapons, and Heavy Weapons grants us a bonus based on what type of weapon we use. So if we have a two-handed sword on, we get 5% damage done, or a 5% damage bonus to all attacks. Again, this is like dual wield with swords. All offensive stats in this game will scale off of this, even magicka abilities. So even if it doesn't use stamina and weapon damage to scale, it will still get 5%. So two-handed for magicka builds, not meta, not suggested, but it's an option. You can make use of this passive with all damage in the game. Now if we use an axe, all of our melee attacks, similar to dual wield, will have a 16% chance to apply a bleed. Remember, bleeds do true damage, but also remember that if we refresh this bleed by hitting again and it manages to proc, then it's going to refresh and do 0 damage. So this is really disadvantageous, especially since it's a 16% chance. So it's going to be way more... it's going to proc way more often, but that's also going to be an issue where it can re-proc before it deals damage, ultimately negating damage. So I would really like to see this and a dual wield's axe bleed be able to stack so that it didn't refresh and it didn't lose anything. So it just added to a duration timer. Still very solid weapon choice. The final one is maces, and all maces do is they cause your attacks to ignore 20% of your target's physical resistance. This is identical to dual wield maces. With dual wield you get 10% per weapon, so up to 20% with 2. And again, it's going to suffer the same issues that the dual wield maces did, where if we're already reducing our target's armor, then we're going to see less of efficiency out of this, especially if we're using that Berserker Strike where our enemy has 0 resistance. There's no incentive to use maces now. So really, really unfortunate that maces have kind of been pushed out of the meta, because the meta just enforces reducing armor or physical resistance or whatever it may be on an enemy, or increasing your own penetration of those, which thus in return lowers the value of that 20% armor ignore we're going to gain. So really, really unfortunate. I'd like to see maces actually be reworked into something else, maybe crit hit damage, maybe increase the damage of other abilities within this skill line. Who knows? Would like to see something else other than armor ignore, because it's just not fitting into the game at the moment. Our next passive is called Balanced Blade, and Balanced Blade is very, very simple. All it does is reduce all stamina costs of your two-handed abilities by 20%. So it's the dual wields controlled flurry, literally identical. So while you have a two-hander active, anytime you cast a two-handed ability, aside from the ultimate, it costs 20% less stamina. Very nice, especially since some of these skills can cost a lot, like Rally and Wrecking Blow. Our next passive is the one that I talked about earlier when we were discussing using Wrecking Blow, and that's Follow-Up. And all that happens is with a two-handed weapon equipped, your successful fully charged, so it has to be the full 2-second charge, heavy attacks increase the damage of your next attack by 10%, and it lasts 10 seconds. So remember, I do a fully charged heavy attack, it deals damage, and I'm granted this buff right here, which is Follow-Up, which gives me 10% damage to my next damage source. And then that 10% can apply to my next heavy attack. So I could literally just sit here and do this over and over and just get a 10% damage to all of my heavy attacks. So really straightforward. The other really nice incentive of heavy attacking is you get 5% of your resources back. So with a two-hander, it would be stamina. So when we're getting our stam back, like if we have to heavy attack or whatever, then we're going to get some resources back and do bonus damage. So really nice, really straightforward, and remember, it can be used in tandem with Wrecking Blow. Make our Wrecking Blow 10% stronger, and then Wrecking Blow makes our heavy attack 20% stronger. Really, really nice use of that passive. And then our last passive is called Battle Rush, and all Battle Rush does is whenever you kill a target for 10 seconds after killing them, you gain 30% bonus stamina recovery, which seems like, okay, well, that's not that good, but 30% stamina recovery is actually quite noticeable. So with that, with an enemy killed, I jump up to about 1500, which is not that much, but if I were to have higher stamina recovery, then the battle rush would be up a lot. And especially in places like Cyrodiil, you don't have to get the killing blow to gain battle rush. So if your allies kill someone or something, then you're going to constantly be having more stamina regen, which means more blocking, more dodge rolling, more healing, more whatever. So really, really helpful passive. But it's not going to be able to take effect in combat in terms of like fighting a single target boss over 10 minutes. It's going to not activate at all until something dies. So in single target fights, really, really weak, and it's not going to offer us any benefit unless we're killing stuff. So I would kind of like to see a redistribution of power, like bring some in combat regen and then have that reward there as well, instead of just having like this humongous reward after killing something. Because if we can't kill something because we're out of stam, then we're gonna die and battle rush is gonna be useless. So I would like to see a secondary component where maybe we get some stamina back while dealing damage or something of the sort. But the really nice thing about two-hander is that if we're going to be making use of follow-up, especially in PvE, stam recovery isn't going to be much of a problem, just because we're going to be constantly gaining our stam back. So I can pretty much infinitely cast Wrecking Blow here. Like, look, I just get all of my stamina back just because I'm heavy attacking. So in PvE, not really necessary, but in PvP, it would still be nice to see some additional stam come to the two-handed class. But that is it for this video, guys. Hopefully you've learned something. I really would like to see some stuff done for two-handed in PvE, because like every single one of these skills ultimately can't be used in terms of efficiency because some weird interaction like Berserker Strike, that physical resistance ignore is going to be useless because we're already doing that with stuff like Sharpened and Breach in sets like Night Mothers and stuff. Wrecking Blow going to be really disadvantageous because that 1 second cast time is going to really throw off the damage. It's not going to scale as high, and it's going to make our rotation very punishing if we're using dots and stuff. Crit Rush, can't use it in PvE, not efficiently, because we're not going to be able to use this as a spammable, and if we do, then we're going to be doing really, really low damage. Brawler or Cleave doesn't hit as many targets as Steel Tornado, doesn't do as much damage as Steel Tornado, doesn't have the execute of Steel Tornado, and that bleed damage that it does is going to be refreshed and not even activate when we're hitting this skill over and over again, ultimately killing it even further. So really, really weak. Reverse Slash is arguably one of the only skills in this line that's good for PvE, because it's going to offer an execute to a class, and it's going to operate really, really strongly. Reverse Slash is going to have a lot of AoE damage, and Executioner is going to have a lot of burst or sustained damage as well. And then Rally is a heal, and gives major brutality, which potions will be giving us in PvE. So another kind of meh skill. Really, really would like to see some stuff done for two-handed in PvE, but that wraps things up with the two-handed skill line. Next, we will go over Sword and Shield. But I hope you've all learned something, found this enjoyable. But I will see you all next time.